Good morning. It's now the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started for today. My name is Coral Owen. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator for the Military Families Learning Network, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's session. Today, we're excited to take a glance back at the notable trends and topics from this past year in personal finance. In case you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our Zoom webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully, you're currently able to view the slides that we're sharing. If you cannot see them or having any other difficulties, please send us a tech support request via email at milfamln@gmail.com. Also, as some of you have already done, we look forward to having you join us today in the chat pod for conversation, questions, and hellos. To embed the chat pod so you don't miss any links or conversations, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You should then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen that has a small chat bubble icon right about in the middle or perhaps to the left. When typing your comments and questions in chat, please do be sure to select the All Panelists and Attendees Response option from the drop-down menu. It's located right above where it says Type Message Here. This simply enables everyone who's on our webinar today to view them in the chat pod and have a better participatory discussion. We'll also be covering evaluation and continuing education information at the end of today's webinar. The Military Families Learning Network is part of a DoD-USDA partnership for military families, and our passion is to connect military family service providers and cooperative extension professionals to research and to each other through innovative online programming. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Molly Herndon, who is the program coordinator with the MFLN Personal Finance team, to introduce our presenter today. Molly?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Coral. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Barbara O'Neill, Financial Resource Management Specialist at Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and this is her 5th annual year in review. So I will turn things over to Dr. O'Neill.
Okay. Thank you so much, Molly. I'm glad to be here. And as Molly said, this is the 5th year that we've been doing this annual Personal Finance Year in Review webinar. And it's actually going to be the 4th year where we'll have a written summary of the content through the Journal of Financial Planning. So I'm just wanting to make sure that people can see the slides here. I'm not seeing those arrows to advance them, Coral, so I just want to make sure that I'm in the right place on the screen. Okay, so while you're checking that, let me just talk a little bit about our objectives for today. What we're going to do is talk about some research studies that were published this past year to give you not only a sense of what was done, but most importantly, the takeaways from those research studies. And we'll also talk about key findings from government data that came out in 2019. And let's see, I just want to make sure here. Scroll my cursor over the bottom left and the arrows will appear. Okay. Let's see. I just want to make sure I don't have to do anything in view options here because we had those arrows before and for some reason I'm not seeing them.
Hi, Barb. Just
Yeah.
try clicking on the slide, just anywhere.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Just the
Thanks.
magic clicking on the slide. Okay, great. Okay, so back to our objectives. We're going to talk about some government data that came out, events and trends and products that came out this past year, legislation and policies that affect our personal finances, resources that are available. We'll preview some of the changes in 2020 that have been announced by Social Security Administration and the IRS particularly. And then we'll have some takeaway and summary slides toward the end. Okay, so let's get started with some conversation here. Thinking back on the last year, what do you think was the most significant personal finance event of 2019? It could be either something that was significant to you personally, so it kind of resonates because you experienced it firsthand. It could be something that you noticed a lot of your clients were experiencing, or just something that you remember from the news as being noteworthy that related to personal finance. So yeah, definitely the shutdown of the government, and we have a slide on that. We're just going to talk about the financial fragility that really exposed when we saw how so many people were living on the edge. The ruling that hospitals will have to show us their pricing beginning in 2021. Interesting. I have to follow that one for the webinar in 2021. Government shutdown. Kimberly's talking about a personal thing, retired, moved to a different state. Rennie's talking about tax reform. Continued improvement of low unemployment and more dollars in middle class pockets. Yeah, and we're seeing that in some of the projections that they're making for holiday spending this year. Jennifer's mentioning the Equifax breach and the resources that are available, and I assume you're also referring to the settlement as well. We'll talk a little bit about that as one of the current events. Okay, so just a lot of different things, and of course, Sherry's mentioning the military blended retirement, which of course is now in full effect this year. And then, of course, Gary's mentioning the stock market. And we have a slide on that toward the end as well. Okay, so lots of different things happened in the world of personal finance. Like I said, I'm going to start out talking first about some of the research that came out, particularly the takeaways. I tried to choose research studies that had key takeaways for our practice as financial educators and counselors. So the first one that came out was the fourth triennial National Financial Capability Study. And this is conducted by the FINRA Financial Education Foundation. They collected the data in 2018, but the report was published in June of 2019. And it's free for downloading. You've got the link on the slide. And one of the things that really stood out to me, and they had a really big sample, over 27,000 respondents, 53%, so more than half of the respondents agreed that thinking about their finances made them anxious. And we had a presenter from the FINRA Financial Education Foundation at AFCPE this year, and he just kind of emphasized that as well, that's kind of underlying a lot of the decisions that people make and their mindsets about personal finance. 42% of student loan debt holders were late with a payment. And then 46% of respondents, so almost half, did not have a 3-month emergency fund. Another interesting statistic was that almost a third, 32%, were earning money from work outside their main employment. So we have a lot of people in this country now that have, sideline work, and gigs, whatever you want to call it. And that, of course, is affecting income volatility quite a bit. Now, for some people, it's kind of money on the side that's kind of gravy in addition to their day job. But then we also have a lot of people in this country that are just working gig to gig. And then they also reported in their study that the amount and the quality of financial education was correlated positively with different indicators of financial capability. And they had a number of them in the NFCS. They had objective measures like scores on a quiz. They had subjective measures like people reporting how they feel about their finances. And all of those metrics correlated positively with financial education. So I guess the big takeaway for all of us is to continue to deliver high quality financial education programs, because we obviously have evidence from this research that it works. Okay, our next interesting study was out of Stanford. And what they looked at is people who are in employer retirement savings plans. Particularly people, and they looked at the differences between people who were kind of automatically enrolled in plans versus people who opt in and choose to save voluntarily. And they found that the workers who had a deep understanding of personal finance were more likely to save more and be more proactive about participating when it was optional. So if you knew a bunch about personal finance and you had to opt in, people opted in. But they didn't find any evidence that financial literacy was associated with saving decisions when the plan automatically enrolled workers, because of course everybody would have been enrolled. And the big takeaway from this study was that the default to enroll and the default of how much gets taken out of your paycheck once you are enrolled, they shouldn't be viewed as one size fits all. In other words, people need to make their own decisions based on their own circumstances as to how much they can deduct out of their paycheck, and also the asset allocation that will be used for the contributions that they make. Okay, the next slide comes out of Ernst and Young, and this is really kind of interesting research, and there's a lot of health parallels as well, as you'll hear in a minute. They found that there was a big disconnect between people's self-perceptions of their financial health and the reality of their financial health. So we have a little, lake woebegone factor going on there, where everybody thinks they're above average, right? So they found 83% of their sample rated themselves good, very good, or excellent in financial health. But then you look at a comparison of that with statistics about low savings for emergencies and retirement. So obviously people are thinking they're doing a lot better than they actually are. But I think the key thing that I found interesting in this study is they found that dismal statistics actually motivate fewer people to save because they see themselves as part of a large group or growing trend. So think about it for a minute. It's kind of like saying, two-thirds of America is overweight or obese. People who have some weight issues might think, oh, okay, well, that's no big deal. I'm part of the two-thirds. Well, it's kind of the same thing with personal finance. If you start telling people that 40% of Americans can't come up with $400 and they're one of that 40%, it's almost like you're norming it for them and making it sound okay. So the big takeaway from this study was that you don't want to be sharing a lot of negative financial statistics with people because it actually demotivates them to save rather than motivating them, which is kind of very interesting. I just saw that and said, wow, because I had been doing that for a while, just telling people, well, all these statistics are so bad. Maybe we don't want to be doing that anymore. Okay, this was a really good study that was actually selected as a prize-winning paper at the Financial Planning Association conference a year ago, and then it got published in 2019. And it came out of the behavioral finance shop at Morningstar. And so they had these behavioral scientists who were thinking about what they call thinking blind spots. In other words, people don't always have everything on their radar when they're making decisions. So what they did is they did a study and they compared when you just ask clients, what are your most important financial goals? And people kind of have to, pull things off the top of their head and say something in response. But then what they did instead is they had a goal list. So you have the link to that goal list on your slide, so you can download it and use it yourself with clients. And so what they found is that 26% of the respondents actually changed their top financial goal when they were prompted with reminders about other goals. So when they saw that list and so, oh yeah, and then they remembered, oh, I forgot to think about that, and oh yeah, that's important too. And um, so the takeaway from this study was to stop asking people to just tell you their goals kind of like on the fly, and instead offer clients a master list and have them look at it for a little bit. And that way they're going to be able to identify goals that are truly important to them. And obviously, if they're important, they're going to be more likely to want to take action to save to achieve those goals. So again, this is really groundbreaking research from the behavioral finance world. Okay, this is a study that I conducted with colleagues. So for full disclosure here, I was the lead author on this study, and we called it As Soon as Financial Decision Making. And this came out of the NC 2172 multi-state research team that I belong to. And what we did is we looked at the decision making of young adults, and we were studying some key decisions that people make, and we wanted to look at financial goals, at home ownership, at retirement planning, and student loans. And we worked with Wisebread, which is a website that deals with young adult finances, and they helped us get a sample. So 69% of our sample was under the age of 45. And one of the key things that we did with this study is we did kind of like an analysis of keywords and sequences of keywords. And we found evidence that respondents were sequencing their financial goals instead of funding them simultaneously. So they used phrases like, well, once I, as soon as I, after I. So in other words, it's after I pay my student loans, I'll save for a house. And after I save for a house, I'll save for retirement, that kind of thing. So the takeaway is to encourage people, particularly young adults, to fund concurrent financial goals rather than sequential financial goals so that they don't delay retirement savings, because otherwise retirement savings will come after everything else and they lose those early decades of compound interest. I will tell you, however, though, if you teach this or you write about it, be prepared for some blowback, because we got it when we started publicizing the results of this study, because there are people who believe very strongly in the Dave Ramsey plan with the baby steps, and you do one thing after another. And so we did get some blowback from some of those people when we started encouraging people to fund goals concurrently rather than sequentially. So just heads up on that. Here's another one that I thought was really interesting. Again, kind of a behavioral finance kind of approach where they tested the framing of savings in different ways. And they found that the more granular you were, so in other words, if you could break it down to the smallest possible increment, like daily savings, versus a less granular format, which would be like monthly savings, you actually encourage better participation in savings programs. So an example would be framing savings as $5 a day versus $150 a month. You have the same outcome, but because the amount is smaller on the daily deposit, it's a little bit more encouraging to people. So they found that the framing of the deposits in daily amounts quadrupled the amount of people who enroll versus monthly amounts. So again, it just kind of gives us a sense that and this, by the way, was it didn't matter on income level. It eliminated any of the participation differences in the savings program between the different groups. So the big takeaway is to really break down large goals into small steps, and people will be more receptive, and you'll have more participation in savings programs, and of course better outcomes for your program results. This was interesting too. This was from Financial Services Review, and they modeled kind of with simulations on computer uh, a different way of donating, in light of the fact that we have the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and fewer people can itemize, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. People are looking at different strategies to make charitable donations so they can get the best tax benefit for them. And this research, what they found is that donors, if they donate appreciated shares of stock or mutual funds, whatever their security is, in value to whatever the cash contribution they were going to make. So let's say you were going to give a charity $1,000. So instead of writing a check for $1,000, you give $1,000 worth of stock. And then what you do is you take that freed up cash that you didn't donate to the charity because you donated the stock instead, and you buy more of the least weighted stock in your portfolio. And so they model this whole strategy out. And of course, it assumes that the stocks need to be held for more than a year. So you're talking about long-term capital gains and not short-term. And what they found, and again, they modeled this with historical data, this strategy, it resulted in higher wealth and lower portfolio risk over time. So their key takeaway was to change the way that you make charitable gifts and donate your most appreciated stock shares instead of cash, and then reinvest the cash that you would have donated to the charity. So interesting results and a lot of implications there for people. Okay, this next one is actually very interesting too. Um, Dementia is a major cause of disability and financial loss. And if any of you have experienced that with a family member firsthand, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When people can't manage their finances, they could be susceptible to fraud. There's all sorts of issues involved. And this really got my attention because it said in the next 30 years, the number of cases of dementia is expected to triple. I mean, think about that. 3 times as many as we have today. And of course, that speaks to the aging population that we have in the United States, in Japan, and in many countries in Europe as well. So the whole world is aging. It's not just our country. And the World Health Organization issued a report in 2019, and they said we need to do everything we possibly can to reduce our risk of dementia. And guess what? There's a lot we can do. They found in this report that all the things that our doctors are telling us that we should do for our heart are actually good for our brain. So we actually have a lot of control over this, which is great. So some of the things they pointed out in this report were regular exercise, not smoking, moderate alcohol use, if any, controlling your weight, eating a healthy diet, maintaining healthy blood pressure, adequate cholesterol and blood sugar levels. So all those things that we're doing to keep a good health status are also going to help in our brain as well. So again, if you're trying to encourage people, some of you I know are from extension and you might be working in multiple program areas, and you're doing health and wealth, here's a perfect connection where people might be really motivated. I don't think there's anybody who wants to end up having dementia in later life. So if you're not able to motivate people by talking about heart risks, talk about this dementia risk. And obviously, it could really affect people's finances as well. The Global Financial Literacy Excellence Group in George Washington University, they come up with this index every year. They just started it 3 years ago. So I think the key takeaway here is that their results have been very stable for the last 2 years and then this year as well. So they're finding about half of Americans can answer the questions correctly that they have on this quiz. It is proprietary, so it's not something that you can duplicate with clients, unlike the National Financial Capability Study, which is kind of open access. They did find that financial knowledge is highest in the area of borrowing and managing debt, lowest in the area of comprehending risk, variations across demographic groups. And you can see there on the slide that the people who tend to do better are males, older adults, people with higher income and educational levels, people who are employed, and people who are retired. So I guess the big key takeaway here is to try to stress risk-related topics in our programs, and that could include insurance and also investment. I mean, that's typically where people are dealing with a lot of risk, either the risks that they're trying to provide coverage for in their insurance policies, or the risks that are associated with choosing investments. So again, kind of interesting. And this is something that will be done every year, this particular study. Okay, then I started something new this year. I found some studies that didn't warrant necessarily having a whole slide about them, but they were just interesting enough, so I call them research tidbits. So we've got a couple slides of these tidbits. Uh, this first one found that 57% of millennials spent money that they weren't planning to on products that they saw in their social media feeds. So I obviously have a little FOMO going on, fear of missing out, and people are being influenced by what they see um, from people who may be posting on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or any of the particular platforms that people are using. Second one is the average 401k contribution rate was 8.8% of salary in the first quarter, and the average employer match was 4.7%. I'm not sure what the contribution rate is on TSP. If anybody happens to know that, that would be an interesting thing to put in the chat, what the averages are on that. And of course, that includes federal employees and service members. I don't know if they have it broken down just by military members as well. But again, we can see that employers, when you have a match, it's good, but the contribution rates. Maybe people could contribute more and they're not. It's hard to say, but at least we have a little bit of a benchmark here in case people ever ask you, well, what does the average person put into their 401k? Now you have a little bit of an answer. Another study was interesting. It found that millennials are using questionable tactics to fund their house down payments. They're tapping out their 401ks. They're moving in with others, parents presumably, to save money to come up with a down payment. And they're selling personal items. And so that was an interesting article. I happened to experience that firsthand when my home buyer lost his pre-approved mortgage 6 days before the closing and had to resort to some of these things to be able to come up with the money to buy my house. So did see that firsthand. Another research tidbit is 23% of U.S. workers say they never plan to retire, despite the realities of aging in the workforce, ageism and that sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting because if 23%, almost a quarter of workers are saying they're never planning to retire, you wonder what kind of preparation they're going to make because they'll think, well, I can continue working. But the reality is that often people experience health issues, layoff issues, caregiving issues, and may not be able to work as long as they thought. Another interesting tidbit, there was a study done in a workplace, well, actually with a financial advisor, and they looked at video vignettes of a conversation with a financial advisor, and they found that when people saw this video and learned from it, because it wasn't them sitting across the table from the financial advisor, but it was a video watching another person sitting across the table from a financial advisor, it actually improved their savvy about Social Security, which is kind of interesting. This other one, I actually had a discussion with my students yesterday in class about when we did current events. People cut their spending when they are told that they have been spending more than others in similar circumstances. That's kind of interesting. It kind of mirrors the studies that were done a few years ago when they told people in hotels how many people, what percentage of people that stay in that hotel hang the towels up and don't get the towels washed every day and that kind of thing, that the compliance actually improved because people had a frame of reference. Well, it's kind of the same thing that people actually, when they are given a frame of reference, um, actually make better spending decisions. They cut their spending if they're spending more than others. So that speaks to maybe a key takeaway is if you can find information and share it with people about what others like them, because people don't want to hear how rich people are spending. They want to hear about people like them. So if you're on a military installation and you have any insights into spending habits, or even savings habits, like how many people on the military installation are enrolled in the TSP plan and how much they're taking out of their paycheck, that kind of thing. That could be really helpful because sharing benchmark information with other people, if it's positive, of course, you don't want to share the negative stuff, but if it's positive, could incentivize people to make positive changes themselves. Another tidbit is that a link was found. This was actually some research that was done by a faculty member here at Rutgers. They found a link between problem gambling and frequently trading cryptocurrencies. And they attributed to a new risk-taking activity and that rush that gamblers get when they're in the heat of the moment gambling. Well, this gives them something else to be trading. Another study found high school personal finance course mandates were associated with smarter student loan borrowing decisions. So that's a good thing. And probably on the negative side, 1 in 4 older adults between the ages of 50 to 80 were reporting feelings of isolation, and they have actually modeled this and found that it may shorten life expectancy as much as smoking. So that's clearly something to be concerned about if you have people who are older and maybe are living kind of an isolated life, so to speak. So those are some tidbits that I found. I don't know. Has anybody found any other interesting research? I'm going to kind of scroll through some of the chat here. So somebody mentioned the Blue Star Families annual report has some statistics about military saving. Okay, that's good to know. Um, let's see if anybody knows of any other kinds of research studies. By all means, go put them into the chat. And in particular, if you have the link to the study, that would be great to share that with others as well. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about some findings that came out through government sources, because government agencies are preparing reports and doing research as well. So this first one is what they call the SHED study. And this has become kind of an annual study as well. SHED stands for Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making, and it comes from the Federal Reserve. And what they found this year in their research report is that 3 in 10 adults have a family income that varies from month to month. So that's huge. I mean, that just speaks to the fact that we just can't teach budgeting in the same way that we might have done 20 years ago. It's got to be taught from the standpoint of many people are going to have peaks and valleys in their income, and teaching them to set aside a reserve so they can pull from that reserve for the months that are kind of lean. More than 25% of young adults under 30 are receiving financial support from someone living outside their home, presumably a parent. Maybe it's a cell phone plan, subsidies for other expenses, perhaps. 39% of respondents could not cover a $400 expense. 27% would have to borrow money or sell something. And 12% just said flat out they couldn't cover it anyway. So that's pretty dismal statistic. Like I said, you probably don't want to share it with an audience because, again, if they're part of that 39%, that might give them kind of license to think, well, I'm not so bad because there's so many other people in the same boat. But it's good for us to know as financial practitioners that so many people are living on the edge. 1 in 5 adults had major unexpected medical bills. Typical student loan payments were between $200 and $299 a month. And 25% of non-retired adults had no savings for retirement or no pension. So that's pretty scary too. 25% of people who are, approaching retirement and really have nothing to live on, perhaps other than Social Security. Um, when I was at AFCPE about 3 weeks ago, I was part of the group that did the financial counseling afterwards, the community service project. And I counseled a woman who was planning to retire the next year, and her 401k balance was $18,000, and that's all she was going to have to live on besides Social Security was at $18,000. Obviously, that wasn't going to go too far. I told that story to my students when we were talking about retirement planning in class last week, and boy, that hit home. So tell stories like that. Tell stories about people who are living on the edge, because again, it can and really be a little bit of motivation there. Maybe not so much the dismal statistics, but just get people thinking about the fact that they could do some savings today for the future. So again, the SHED study is a good benchmark for what Americans are doing with their finances. The Census Bureau came out with this study. They looked at poverty and health insurance. They found that fewer Americans are living in poverty, which is the good news, but more lack health insurance. Not so good news. They found that 27.5 million people, which is about 8.5% of the population, lacked health insurance in 2018, and that's up from 7.9% in 2017. It's going to be interesting to see when this year is fully over what the statistics will be for 2019, because this is the first year since the ACA took effect, where there is no individual mandate penalty for not having health insurance. So we'll have to track that in the future. So this was the first increase in the number of people that are lacking health insurance since the ACA took full effect in 2014. The poverty rate fell to 11.8%. That's the lowest since 2001. So there is some evidence that some of the positive changes in the economy have started to affect people at the lowest echelons of incomes, which is good news. This was a report that came out on federal financial literacy reform. It came out through the Treasury Department. And some of the key recommendations from this report was they recommended better coordination of federal financial literacy programs that are coming out through the various agencies, trying to avoid duplication, trying to leverage the work of nonprofits, the private sector, and state and local governments, in addition to what the federal government is doing. They also called for an identification of best practices and metrics for evidence-based effective programs, and also to better identify the challenges and the opportunities associated with technology and personal finance, different fintech applications, for example. Another study came out through Treasury Department. They were looking at financial literacy and education at institutions of higher education. So any of you that teach at the college level will find this helpful. They recommended their key recommendations, again, identifying best practices. That's what these government agencies are really looking for. They want to see what is the best stuff that's going out on in financial education, and they want to get that identified so that these best practices can be replicated by others. They also wanted to communicate the importance of graduation and major on repayment of student loans, because obviously if students don't graduate or they don't earn much income to be able to pay their loans back, that's a big issue. And they also said there needed to be more preparation of students for what they will owe when they graduate. Very often students graduate, they may know their loan balance, but they don't know what that translates into as a monthly payment. And then this other report came out through the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And what they were looking at was youth financial education. And their key takeaways were when you have a well-implemented state financial education mandate for personal finance education, that leads to improvements in financial behaviors, and that there is evidence that many U.S. financial education programs for youth improve financial knowledge. So that's good news. They also cautioned in the report, however, that other countries rather, have much more robust and rigorous research than we have in the United States when it comes to documenting the impact of youth financial education. Many of them are using randomized controlled trials to study program effects, and that we should look to evidence not only here in this country, but also from other countries as to the evidence of financial education impacts. Okay, so that's kind of the research section, and I hope that's given you kind of a sense of some of the findings that have come out this past year, and more importantly, some of the implications from those findings. So now I'm going to turn my attention to events, trends, and products that happened during 2019. And I've tried to group them together, and when the journal article comes out in the Journal of Financial Planning, they'll all be grouped together in different paragraphs for topics like taxes and that sort of thing. So we'll start with taxes, and as you know, this was the first year where we had a tax filing season following the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So 2018, of course, was the first year that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, took effect, but all of those returns were being filed at the beginning of this year. So what we learned is that more than 25 million taxpayers switched from claiming the standard deduction instead of itemizing. So the share of tax returns that included a Schedule A for itemized deductions dropped to about 10% from previously it had been about 30% of returns that had itemizers. The most common deductions that kind of are left under the TCJA are SALT, state and local taxes, charitable donations, and mortgage interest. And some people also can itemize medical deductions if they have expenses greater than 10% of their AGI. That's not a good way to itemize because it obviously means somebody's pretty sick, but it is a deductible expense as well. The one thing that really caught my attention is in one of the articles that I read. I hadn't thought about it in quite this way until I read it, is that it's easier for singles to itemize than couples. So this speaks to almost like going back to kind of a marriage tax kind of thing. Because if you think about it, if you have singles, and you can deduct up to $10,000 on state and local taxes. Um, the standard deduction for singles was 12,000 um, 200. So you only had to get another $2,200 to get over, the hump, so to speak, and then you could start itemizing. But for the married couples filing jointly, they would have to have an excess of $14,400 over the SALT cap to be able to itemize. So it's a much bigger hurdle. So you kind of wonder if that's affecting any decisions on people getting married or not. I don't know. Something to think about if you're a tax policy wonk like I am. Okay, related to taxes, the IRS acknowledged earlier this year, that the 2017 tax law changes were confusing. Surprise, surprise, right? And they also acknowledged that their first tax withholding calculator did not account for all of the moving parts that were part of the Tax Cuts and Job Act. So it didn't factor in a lot of things like the loss of the exemptions, the fact that many people had lost a lot of itemized deductions, and that kind of thing. So the consensus was that about 20% of taxpayers didn't pay enough taxes throughout 2018. Um, a lot of people actually did very well, but they didn't realize it because they got a little bit of a bump in their paycheck instead of a big refund in 2019. So they felt like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act really didn't help them, even though it might have, because they just didn't feel the big refund bump that they'd been used to. So what happened earlier this year is the IRS realized, well, there was a lot of chatter on social media for sure, and a lot of media reports, and it became clear that a lot of people had not withheld enough income tax. So they adjusted what they call the safe harbors on under withholding, and they lowered the threshold to having to only have 85% of the amount of correct withholding that you should have had, um, down from the typical 90%, which is part of tax law. These are called the safe harbors for avoiding under withholding tax. So this is pretty profound because it indicated that they knew that a lot of people did not have enough tax withheld from their pay. Also, this year, related to taxes, is in July, the IRS unveiled a new form that will be available in 2020, but they put it out in 2019 for public comment. It's called the 1040 SR, and this is for people who are age 65 plus. It includes a larger font size and a more prominent chart for calculating the standard deduction, because if you're 65 plus, you get an extra standard deduction based on age. So it's going to be available for taxes that we'll be filing for 2019 earlier next year in 2020. You have to be at least 65. You don't necessarily have to be retired. Big but, if you're still, working as a small business owner, perhaps, or you have freelance income and you're having to file a Schedule C, you'll still need to use the standard 1040. And if you're able to itemize, you'll also need to use the standard 1040, even if you're 65 plus. Okay, let's turn our attention to health insurance. So this is kind of interesting. Starting in 2019, as I mentioned before, there's no federal penalty for not having health insurance. However, there are certain states that have enacted their own mandates and penalties for not having health insurance. So you got to know your state law. So I happen to live in one of those states. So New Jersey and Washington, D.C. passed laws this year. They went into effect in 2019 that we have a state penalty for not having health insurance. So even though the federal penalty has gone away, if you live in New Jersey and Washington, D.C., and you didn't have health insurance, you're going to get nailed on your state tax form. Vermont passed a law that goes into effect in 2020, and Massachusetts actually had the first state health insurance penalty law since 2006 when Mitt Romney was governor, more than a decade ago. So check your state law if you live in one of those states. And there could be some more states that will pass laws in the future. So you need to kind of watch that. Also related to health insurance, what the statistics have shown so far, I mean, we haven't ended the year completely, but there has been a drop in coverage among people who buy health insurance in the individual market and pay the full cost. So these are not people who are buying through healthcare.gov. These are people who are buying it privately because now, of course, in 2019, they're not going to get hit with a fee on their taxes. That's probably been one of the major reasons. The marketplace plans, however, have seen their enrollment hold pretty steady, and we'll see the statistics when the enrollment closes at the end of this year. We'll be able to see a little bit more about how marketplace plans were affected. Um, One article that I read said that 9.3 million low to moderate income enrollees receive tax credits to help them pay their plan premiums. So that's a key thing. Also, it's important to remember that the employer mandate still applies to employers with 50 or more full-time employees. So they still have to be providing health insurance to their workers. That didn't go away. We saw this year record high interest on credit cards. So the average annual percentage rate, or APR, is about 17%. It's the highest rate in more than 2 decades. The reason for this is that creditors are charging higher interest rates to offset their generous rewards programs because these reward programs are eating into their profits and they can't get rid of them because they have to remain competitive and there's a loyalty factor and you can't just axe the rewards program. So what they're doing is charging people who pay interest, people who revolve a balance from month to month. They're the ones that are really getting hit with this because they're the ones that are paying these higher interest rates. The average margin is 11.72%. So this is the margin of profit above the market rate. It's the highest margin on record. So interest rates are really high. The average APR on private label cards, so these would not be the bank cards, these would be like retail stores, that kind of thing, 27.5%. And among households with balances, they owe an average of $8,602. So that's a lot of money being owed on credit cards. This is kind of interesting too. Morningstar announced this year that it's in the process of developing an evaluation system for what they call blockchain crypto assets. So this will be, Bitcoin, Ethereum, all the different cryptocurrencies that are out there. And this is going to be launched by the end of next year. So we'll have to watch this one. It's predicted that billions, and again, we're talking worldwide, not just the US, billions of dollars could move into the cryptocurrency space, almost like an asset class if the ratings go into effect and the asset class is going to seem a little bit more credible when it has a Morningstar rating. So this is going to be kind of interesting to watch. Again, this is not for the faint of heart. People need to know what they're doing. When it's one thing to use Bitcoin for purchases, but if you're going to be using it as an investment asset class, you seriously have to know what you're doing, and you seriously have to have a pretty high risk tolerance level as well. something to watch. Um, this is also very interesting. We're seeing the rise of the non-bank banks. So this was the shot across the bow. In July, Betterment, which is one of the robo-advisory firms that's out there, Wealthfront is another one. Those are probably the two most well-known robo-advisory firms. Betterment started an FDIC protected savings account with a 2.69% yield. Wow. Compare that to what your basic brick and mortar bank is offering as a yield on savings these days. So what they're doing is that they're partnering with multiple partner banks, and they're offering FDIC insurance either of $1 million, and some of them are actually up to $1.5 million. Because if you can partner with 6 banks, for example, and each bank has $250,000 limit for FDIC, and you can prorate people's money around the different banks, all of a sudden people have $1.5 million worth of FDIC insurance. So this is huge. Wealthfront has also introduced a non-bank bank, and so has SoFi. So one of my students was interested last week in SoFi, and I got in touch with a former colleague in Extension who serves on SoFi's advisory council, Taylor Spangler. She sent me some information, and SoFi is about a 1.60 yield, but again, a whole lot higher than what banks are paying. So you're going to see a lot of fintechs getting into this space to attract deposits. And what's in it for them is that they have the apps. They're developing the apps. And if they can get people hooked on their savings account, they might get them hooked on their apps. And there's a lot of synergies going on there. And their big target audience is young adults, the millennials and the Gen Zs behind them, who are really tired of paying fees and getting low yields on their savings. So this is another one that we want to watch in the future. Okay, ATM and overdraft fees. Again, another record year of increases. So I've been tracking this every year since we've been doing the webinar series, and they climbed again to a record high in 2019. The average surcharge for a non-customer to use an ATM to withdraw cash is over $3. The average fee by a customer's own bank when you use a foreign ATM that's not associated with the bank is $1.63. The average overdraft fee is $33 and change. And the takeaway is you can avoid these fees by using your own bank's ATM, and also making sure that you keep tab on your account balances so you don't get into an overdraft situation. Okay, car costs. The average price for a light duty vehicle. I had to look that phrase up. I said, "What's a light duty vehicle?" That's an average car. I mean, I guess they go by tons and stuff. So, you're talking about your SUVs, your cars, that kind of thing. The average price, $37,400. The average loan amount, and this comes from experience, so they're obviously tracking this through their credit reporting database, $32,119. The average new car loan term is 69.17 months, so we're approaching 6 years. AAA reported that every 12 months that you extend a car loan costs an owner nearly $1,000 more in additional finance charges. And AAA also reported a record average yearly cost of owning a car, $9,282. And that's $773.50 a month. So that's everything associated with the car ownership, the loan, the tags, maintenance, gas, you name it. That's the cost that they're reporting. Okay, I would be remiss as a certified financial planner if I didn't report that this year was the 50th anniversary of the financial planning profession. So in 1969, in December of 1969, actually, so we're really close to the 50th anniversary, 13 people from different areas of the financial services industry got together and they met at the O'Hare Airport Hotel in Chicago. And over a period of days, they planted the seeds of what would become the financial planning profession. Eventually, what resulted were professional associations, a certifying body eventually, and then, of course, the College for Financial Planning, which to this day provides professional development for people who are seeking the Certified Financial Planner credential. So, what these 13 people wanted to do was to focus on a client's needs holistically rather than focus on selling commission-based products. And there's been a lot of, peaks and valleys and successes and challenges over these 50 years and name changes as well. And at one point we had ICFP and IFP, and now we have uh, this CFP board, which is the certifying body. We have FPA, which is the professional association. Um, that 69 meeting led to, in 1973, 42 CFPs were graduated. That was the first class of certified financial planners. Today, there are about 85,000 certified financial planners here in the United States and about 181,000 worldwide. So definitely a lot has happened in 50 years. Speaking of financial planning, we had that fiduciary rule that was out there for a while that the U.S. Department of Labor was working on. And I mentioned in last year's webinar that that was vacated by a federal court in 2018. So it kind of went away, except it didn't totally go away, because what we saw is that some states uh, were trying to come up with their own state level fiduciary rules. If it couldn't get passed at the federal level, the states were saying, well, let's take it on at our level. And many of them were dissatisfied with the SEC's new standards that were being put out in the wake of the DOL fiduciary rule. Actually, here in New Jersey, it's probably gotten the most attention. And there's been a lot of media coverage of a rule that's been proposed. And then there's been a number of other states, Nevada, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Illinois, and Maryland, that are also in various stages of discussing or attempting to implement some kind of state level fiduciary rule. So again, something to watch if you're in any of those states, kind of a work in progress there. And then, of course, we heard about the Capital One hack. And you mentioned that in the chat before. So this affected about 106 million people. It included credit card customers, people who have Capital One cards, and people who had applied for Capital One cards. And this was due to data that were stored in the cloud, so to speak. And it was actually Amazon's cloud, which kind of makes you wonder there. But anyway, all of the research and reports that I saw, they use words like poorly configured firewall, poor controls. That was kind of what they put the blame on. So the key takeaways for our consumers are, again, encouraging people to freeze their credit. It's free. Encouraging people to change their passwords. Encouraging people to set up two-factor authentication, whether it's a challenge question or a text to a phone or something that gives an extra level of security. And then, of course, just monitoring your credit, checking your credit report regularly to look for evidence of identity theft. So just like we had one hack, we settled another one. So we did have the Equifax settlement. Equifax happened in 2017, so 2 years worth of webinars ago. The deal that was announced was at least $575 million. And that included, they estimated $300 million to cover the cost of free credit monitoring. $175 million was going to go to the states for various things that they would be doing in settlement. And $100 million was going to go to CFPB for penalties. At the time, they were announcing that it could actually go up to $700 million if the initial amount was not sufficient to handle all the people who were signing up. Consumers were offered a choice of up to 10 years of free credit monitoring or up to $125. But notice it said up to, because again, they were unsure how many people were going to file claims. Quite honestly, I haven't seen anything recently on how many people did file and how the numbers settled out. So if anybody has an update on that, put it in the chat, because I'd love to see if there's any more um, a follow up to that. I know I personally signed up, but I don't know that I've actually seen anything as far as the monitoring. They did also settle on the fact that starting next year, you could get up to 6 Equifax credit reports each year for 7 years. So that's something to pass along to people as well. Um, and up to $20,000 in cost recovery if you had identity theft that occurred after the breach. So again, that's something that was put in to help people who really did have an incident related to the Equifax breach that happened. So interesting that we had one new breach and a settlement of another one. 3 Federal Reserve interest rate cuts in 2019. This is significant, particularly any of you who either personally or have clients who are looking to get a mortgage or a large loan, like a car loan, something like that. So basically, these interest rate cuts that took place in 2019 nearly reversed all of the interest rate increases that took place in 2018. And some of the reasons that were given were uncertainty about the trade war, slowing global growth. These are some of the things that the Fed would put out in their explanations. They did signal, however, with their third rate cut that took place in October, that they were going to pause to reassess the data. So it was the Fed's way of saying, don't necessarily bank on the fact that there's going to be another interest rate cut. We're going to take a pause and look at see what's happening out there. So this obviously has good effects, like I said, for anybody who's trying to get a mortgage or any borrowing, because if anybody has any kind of variable rate loan that's tied to Federal Reserve rates, that's good news for you people as well. Okay, then we have the stock market. So the markets rebounded to start the year, and that was good. So we started off on a good note. We had a bout of volatility in May. By mid-November, some reports were calling the market the best bull market ever, because they're really going back to 2009 when things turned around after the end of the Great Recession. So they're looking at that whole 10-year history. Um, and it's interesting, my students had to do their mutual fund assignment 2 weeks ago, where they had to look at mutual funds and read the prospectuses for 3 mutual funds and then compare them and choose the best fund for them. And since we're 10 years out now from the Great Recession, a lot of those 10-year performance figures are looking a lot better, because the 2007 2008 data is starting to drop off, and we're seeing the effects of having been in a very long bull market. So some of the key factors here are Federal Reserve actions, the U.S. China trade war and tariffs. Anytime something is said about the trade war, that can set off the market. We saw that very recently. By November 1st, we had reached new highs for the Standard & Poor's 500 and the NASDAQ indices. And I'm sure you're well aware that on November 15th, after I had submitted the slides to be reviewed and prepped for this webinar, and on November 15th, the Dow passed 28,000 for the first time in history. So that was another milestone. It's dipped back a little bit since, but we're still close to that 28,000, not too far down from there. So that was another milestone as well in the stock market. But again, keep in mind that only about half Americans have any exposure to stocks. So for half of America, these statistics are meaningless because they don't have any personal stake in the stock market, either by owning individual stocks, owning mutual funds, or having retirement savings plans that invest in mutual funds. Okay, child savings programs. We've heard these things being written about for years. I can remember we had Governor Corzine here in New Jersey, and he was talking about this. People have been talking about child savings programs for at least 2 decades. And again, if you're a policy wonk like I am, you kind of pay attention when they actually implement one on a large state scale. So this is significant. The state of Pennsylvania established this year what they call the Keystone Scholars Program. It gives every baby that's born or adopted in the state of Pennsylvania $100 in an account managed by the state to use for college. Now, granted, $100 isn't a whole lot of money, but it's seed money, and that's the whole point. And this is based on research that has found that if a child has a savings account, it increases the chances fourfold that a child from a low income family will attend college. And there are actually 65 child savings programs across the country now that are covering 482,000 children. So this is pretty significant, especially if it catches on and goes national. Another thing that came out this year is the Department of Labor had a rule that makes it easier for small businesses to band together and offer joint 401ks to their employees. It's called an Association Retirement Plan, or ARP. Something to keep in mind because, again, you may have constituents who are in a government plan, or in the case of military families, you probably have somebody in the TSP, but maybe they're married to somebody who is in the private sector, and particularly in a small business may not have ever had access to a 401k. Now these small businesses can band together, and it can be offered by um, employers who are in a city, in a county, in a state, in a multi-state metropolitan area, so you might have, people on both sides of a border, for example, or even in a nationwide industry. So the whole purpose of this ruling is to enable small businesses to try to get comparable to large employers and be able to offer a retirement plan. So that's big. Speaking of retirement and working and employers, the majority of baby boomers are still in the labor force. 29% of the oldest boomers, who are age 65 to 72, were working or looking for work in 2018. Of course, this data was reported in 2019. Is the highest annual rate for this age group in more than half a century. And while we often see the statistic that 10,000 boomers are turning 65 every day, only 5,900 of them are exiting the labor force. So keep that in mind. Interesting. Let's talk about millennials. The oldest millennials are approaching middle age. They're 38 years old, and they're approaching middle age in worse financial shape than any living generation ahead of them. They have less wealth, they have less property, they have lower marriage rates, and they have fewer children. The US birth rate is at the lowest level in 32 years. And as you can well imagine, there's some people, actuaries at the Social Security Administration, who are kind of in a lot of angst about this. It's expected to create a $2 trillion deficit in Social Security over the next 75 years. So again, something to watch. And then, of course, there's the shutdown. We couldn't talk about 2019 without talking about the government shutdown, because what we saw was real-time financial fragility played out every night on the news. And I saw it through the news reports that were coming from New Jersey. Cape May, big Coast Guard town. People were going to food banks. People were reaching out to social service agencies. I happened to be in Florida. Same thing was happening Yankeetown, another big Coast Guard community. So all across the country, particularly in places where there was a large concentration of people who were affected by the financial government shutdown, it was huge. It lasted 35 days, and it had a major impact on the lives of the people who were affected. So Prudential actually conducted a study a couple months later of 350 people who were impacted firsthand by the shutdown. Some of them were federal employees, and some of them were contractors who were also affected. And what they found is that nearly half fell behind on their bills, more than a quarter missed a mortgage or rent payment, nearly a quarter cut back or eliminated spending on health or medical expenses for themselves or family members. More than 80% said that their overall stress levels spiked, with half reporting that they became much more stressed. That was one of the options that they could check, I guess. And in a majority of the cases, people burn through most or all of their emergency savings. So this is huge, and it really just showed how fragile so many households are. And I think we got a lot of good stories out of this, because before you would have the shed study and you would read a statistic and you would say, this percentage of people can't come up with $400. We saw it in real life. So hopefully that's kind of made an impact on some people, and maybe encouraged them to boost a little bit more of their emergency savings. Okay, and then I got some trend tidbits as well. So some of them are positive, some of them are negative, in no particular order. Social Security, the projection that was done in 2019 by the Social Security trustees. They're projecting that Social Security will be insolvent in 2035 and Medicare in 2026. This doesn't mean that there won't be any more of these programs. It just means that the trust funds will be gone. Obviously, there still will be taxes coming in. FICA tax will still be coming out of people's paychecks. So what will happen is that these programs will really become more pay as you go, because there won't be any surplus, because it will have been spent down according to their projections. Another thing that happened is that payday loan protections that were proposed to go into effect for civilian borrowers were rolled back by the CFPB. There were protections that were, supposed to have gone into effect that would have given a little bit of a test, if you will, of how people would be able to pay back their loans. That all went away. But it's important to remember that we still have protections for military families, and that's under the MLA, the Military Lending Act. And that does include a 36% military annual percentage rate as part of that law. Also, if you were a fan, 47-year-old Money magazine, at least the print version, went out of business. You'll still find Money magazine content, CNN Money online, but the print magazine ended with the June issue this year. Another tidbit, auto loan delinquencies surged past the Great Recession rate, and there are 7 million borrowers that are 90 or more days behind. So this is huge. A lot of people are falling behind. And of course, you saw the statistics before as to how much a new car is costing and what the average loan is, $32,000 and change for a loan. That's a lot of debt to have. So people are falling behind. We also saw this year the year where there were more states ever that enacted financial literacy requirements at the state level. We've never had a year than this year where there have been more states that have either enacted or proposed a requirement to have a course in personal finance. North Carolina became the 20th state to do that earlier this year. So more and more states now are enacting these financial literacy requirements. And I would just say, as somebody who lives in a state who just enacted a middle school requirement and has had a high school requirement, those of you that are working in the communities particularly, you're going to be busy, because there's a lot of capacity building that has to go on to build the capacity of teachers in states that are enacting these requirements. So be prepared. And then also, consumer debt hit $4 trillion for the first time this year. And then, interestingly enough, I told my students this the other day, and they couldn't quite believe that there was a world without the internet, but there was. The World Wide Web actually officially was conceived in March of 1989. There was a paper that was written that laid out how the net could evolve. And so 30 years later, we're celebrating the 30th birthday of the World Wide Web. Also this year, another trend tidbit, 1.6 million Americans who received a tax refund in 2018 owed taxes in 2019. So again, that speaks to the withholding that we talked about before. And then also something, there's going to be a new tax withholding form next year. It was announced in 2019 in July, and again, it was put out for public comment. And one of the things that you'll see in the new tax withholding form is they're doing away with the term withholding allowances. So if you've been teaching withholding allowance, erase, because that's not going to be part of the new W-4 form. And make sure if you're teaching anything about withholding that you take a look at that new form so that you're current on what it looks like. Okay, military trends, demographics. I'm going to point you to this report. You can get all the details. This actually comes from Pew Research. They did a comprehensive report of the changing profile of the U.S. military. And their key findings were that the military is smaller in size, more diverse, and that there are more women in leadership positions. Another thing that affects military members is the TSP has changed withdrawal options. So this would be when people separate from service. And they now have a little bit more flexibility in the types of withdrawals that they can make. So if you're 59 and a half or older, and you're still working in either federal government or uniform service, you can take up to 4 in-service withdrawals each year. And you can actually choose whether you want your withdrawal to come from a Roth balance, a traditional balance, or a proportional mix of the two types of accounts. Other changes that they have announced is that you no longer need to make a full withdrawal election after you turn 70 and a half and are separated from federal service. However, that doesn't negate the fact that you still have to take your RMDs. So you're still going to have to take out the amount that's required for the minimum distribution. If you're a separated participant, you can take monthly, quarterly, or annual payments, and you can stop, start, or make changes to your installment payments at any time. So this is great for people who maybe need some flexibility in determining the income that they're going to take. And then also they announced that they have enhanced tools that people can use on the TSP website to make the changes that they need to make to their withdrawals. Also, free credit monitoring for service members. So this started end of October. There is now free electronic credit monitoring available for people who are in active duty and National Guard. And what this will do is alert recipients to either mistakes on their credit report or evidence of identity theft. And the notification can be done through an app, through email, or through text messaging. And some of the things that can be reported include late payments, foreclosures, liens, and any new accounts that might be opened in a service member's name. So again, good consumer protection there for service members. Okay, did I miss anything? So I'll just put that out. If there's anything that I missed that happens either in the world of personal finance or in the world of military personal finance, put it in the chat. You know, I tried to look for things that kind of affected a lot of people, particularly the types of people that we all serve, you know, people who are, you know, middle income, low, moderate income, middle income, often struggling with their finances. But again, if you can think of anything else, let me know. Thank you, Becky, for the kind comment. Okay, so just a little bit on government legislation and policies that happened this year. Actually, not too much has happened. A lot of talk, but not a whole lot of action, really. So there was a lot of information that came out this summer, including a study that was done by the Kaiser Foundation that reported that 1 in 6 times that somebody goes into an emergency room or a hospital, the treatment is followed by a surprise medical bill from an out-of-network provider. So you might be going into the hospital and giving them all your cards and numbers, and you think everything is hunky-dory, and you get out, and 2 months later, there's a bill. So how many of you have had that happen to you? You know, probably quite a few of you. Say yes if you have, you know, the surprise bill. And what the research found is that some states have higher surprise rates than others. So a lot of it has to do with the breadth of the networks, that medical networks that they have in a state. So some states have more providers and choice, if you will, than others. Some places it's pretty sparse. You may only have one hospital in a small rural town, right? So some of the things that often become surprise, surprise, are emergency transport to a hospital that's not in network, ER physicians and anesthesiologists that are not contracted with the insurer. So there has been legislation that has been discussed in Congress, but it's basically stalled. And a lot of it is attributed to deep-pocketed lobbyists who obviously would lose if changes were made. So stay tuned. Might be something to contact your federal government officials on, but basically it's gone nowhere. Secure Act. We heard quite a bit about that too. So Secure is an acronym for setting every community up for retirement enhancement. So Secure for short. And this was actually passed by the House of Representatives in June. And it was called the most ambitious attempt to improve retirement security in more than a decade. So you'd have to go back to 2006 to have as many different retirement related things passed in a bill. And what this bill would do would encourage small employers to provide retirement plans. It would encourage plan participation through defaults. There was also a provision in this that would have raised the age for required minimum distributions from 70.5 to 72. But it's in limbo. So basically nothing has happened with the Secure Act. It's in limbo. That's all I can say. But again, watch it. Maybe something will happen in the future. Okay, if I missed anything else, put it in the chat as well. And if you saw any other interesting federal legislation or policies. I'm just going to finish up with a few concluding slides so we stay on time. Any new or revised financial education resources? So if you found something that came out this year that was particularly helpful, put that in the chat as well. I'll just share my old standby that I share every year, which is the annual limits relating to financial planning. This comes out from the College for Financial Planning, and they put this out to keep people who are certified financial planners or studying for the CFP designation up to date with all the changes. So this is the one for 2019. I checked this morning. I haven't seen the 2021 come out yet, but probably right after the beginning of the year, they'll have an updated one that will have all the limits for 2020 as well. So again, if you can think of anything else that has come out in the past year related to resources for financial education, let us know. Okay, I want to end with what we can expect for 2020 coming down the pike. So we are basically, 21 days out from New Year's Day. So what can we expect? Well, the IRS has issued the contribution limits for 2020. So there's modest increases. The biggest one would be for retirement savings plans. So it would be 401k, 403b, 457, and TSP, even though it's not listed there. It includes TSP as well. And this has to do with the elective deferrals. And so it's going up $500 for everyone and another $500 for people who are eligible for catch-up contributions. So that's people who are 50 and over by the end of the year. So instead of being able to contribute 19,000 and 25,000 with the catch up this year, it'll be 19,500 and another 6,500 for the catch up next year. IRAs are going to stay the same for the limit and the catch up limit. And then there's modest increases in what they call the phase outs And then the simple plans that are for people in corporations go up a little bit as well. So again, modest increases to the limits that we have in effect for this year. Social Security announced that the beneficiaries will receive a 1.6% cost of living adjustment next year. So a little bit of a bump there. The maximum taxable earnings is 137,700. So people who earn more than that, um, after they reach that amount, they no longer have tax taken out. And of course, that's something that's been subject to a lot of debate. There are some who argue that very rich people should have Social Security coming out of all their earnings. So again, something that could change. A quarter of coverage is $1,410. So modest bump up, when you can get 4 quarters in a year. Um, and then, of course, you need 40 quarters to be eligible for benefits. The earnings test exempt amount next year will be $18,240 if you collect benefits prior to full retirement age. And the estimated average benefit this year, or next year rather, will be $1,503, which translates into a little over $18,000 a year in annual Social Security income. Again, that's average. Everybody, of course, is going to be different based on their own earnings history. Estate taxes, they are going to bump up a little bit too. The exemption will. So the estate and gift tax exemption will be $11.58 million per person. And then double that if you have married couples and you file the paperwork that's necessary for what they call portability, which is where you take the unused portion of one spouse and put it onto another. So you have to elect that, and it has to be done on the estate tax return of the first spouse to die. And then the annual gift tax exclusion amount remains at $15,000 that you can give to any one person next year. Other changes that we'll see in 2020, there's going to be a higher contribution limit for health savings accounts. Um, I mentioned the catch-up contribution will remain the same for retirement accounts, and it will also remain the same for health savings accounts as well. They've indexed some of the other numbers as well for health savings accounts, including the definition of high deductible health plan. That's what HDHP stands for. The standard deduction will rise slightly as well, and there'll be the same $1,300 for people who are age 65 and over for their standard deduction. Some of the disturbing trends that we'll want to watch for next year is that U.S. credit card debt is rising. Only about 46% of Americans are confident about retirement. Americans aren't following budgets. Only about 39% use a budget. Car loan delinquencies that I mentioned earlier. Americans, many of them are lacking emergency savings, and U.S. student loan debt has reached $1.67 trillion. Next slide, just some key takeaways. If you want to summarize what we talked about for the last 90 minutes, we've had the tax law changes in 2017 cause challenges in refunds and withholding in 2019. We saw from the research that if you frame savings discussions and goal setting in different ways, they produce positive results. New charitable donation strategies are needed. States are passing laws to deal with issues that the federal government isn't addressing. Data hacks are continuing to be a threat. Consider credit freezes, and then relatively minor changes in tax laws for next year. And then finally, I'm going to send you off with a to-do list. So these are some things that you might want to do by the end of the year. So you have 21 days to do them. If you're 70 and a half, you want to take those RMDs. You might want to look at reviewing your asset allocation and rebalancing your portfolio. You might want to review and revise your tax withholding. Think about new ways to make charitable gifts. Consider what they call tax loss harvesting, and you'll have to review your capital gains and losses to see if that makes sense. Flexible savings accounts, you want to spend down those flexible spending accounts. Consider a Roth conversion. And it's always good to do a status review. Look at your estate plans, your beneficiaries, insurance policies, net worth, digital assets, all of those kind of things. So I think I'm going to end it there, and I will turn it over to Molly to kind of close us out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. O'Neill. That was a great look back at the year. We'll over to the next slide. I invite you all to join us on January 21st for tax updates, new year, new forms, new thresholds. This will be an exciting look at the changes from taxes from last year. So please get that on your calendar. Thank you all for joining us. And this webinar is approved for 1.5 CEUs for AFCs and CPFCs. Please visit the event page where you'll be directed to the post-test by clicking on the Continuing Education Credit Certificate button. After the close of the evaluation, you can click on the link for the test. If you have any questions about the process for CEUs, please email me at mollyh2@extension.org. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Molly. I just wanted to echo Molly's thanks to Dr. Neal for sharing her expertise with us today, as well as her time. It's always nice to end the year off on this note, taking a glance back and as well as a look forward at what's to come. We'll keep the room open here for just another couple minutes in case you need to collect any links or just catch up on some information. Do know, however, that all of the materials, including the slides and additional resources, are available for you on the event page. And that's also the link that is posted here as to where you can find continuing education information, access the evaluation and post-test link. And then we'll also be posting the recording of today's session should you wish to go back, review, and or share this information with anyone who may be interested. So thanks again for tuning in. We wish you a wonderful holiday season, and we look forward to seeing everyone again in 2020.